Hey everybody, this is Andrew Benjamin with the We Are Rising podcast. We got a very special guest of us today, part of New York Comic Con. He'll be at New York Comic Con, where you can purchase his new book, Blood on the Holler, David Sangiao-Parga. I got it right, I hope.
Yeah, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, author of the book, and it's about we cover pro wrestling here, so it is about pro wrestlers who get caught in, shall we say, some nefarious individuals. I'll leave it
Yes,
at that. But yeah, David, thank you so much for talking to us. I really appreciate it.
thank you. Thank you
Uh,
for having me.
oh, no problem. So just tell us a little about yourself as an author. I don't, is this your first full novel that you've written and published?
Yes, yes, it is. Yeah, the very first one. I had a short story that's been published in an anthology that it's called Stars and Wanderers. That came out about 6 months before the novel, but this is my first full length novel. Yes.
So what is the process of writing the first novel? Is that, I mean, did you know where to start from? How did that whole, tell us how that whole thing worked out for you?
Well, it started as a short story. I just sat down one day. I was thinking of something I wanted to work on. I had an idea for a short story that's based off of. I don't know if you've ever heard the story about Shawn Michaels back in the '90s, he had a an altercation in a bar with some people and got pretty roughed up. Uh, it's a favorite
Hmm.
kind of behind the scenes story of mine that I love, and I thought, well, wouldn't that be fun to kind of extrapolate on that and make a little story, a fictionalized story of something like that with a wrestler running across a situation with some truly nefarious characters. And it started out as a short story of just a wrestler walking into a diner that's being robbed, and it kind of just grew from there. And it just kept growing and growing. And I was trying to get into the creative writing program at Florida International University at the time. So I sent them a sample of that to as part of my application. They thought it was really good. And then I went on. I used it in different classes for plot structure, for screenwriting. I adapted it into a screenplay, and then eventually I used it as my thesis project. And actually, you can still find a really early, embarrassing version of it on FIU's website under all the thesis projects. If you look for my name, you can find it. But uh, but that's far from the finished product. But yeah, and then went from there. And then after that, I started taking it around all the usual places, agents, publishers, to see if anybody might be interested. And it was a bit of a hard sell at first. There were a lot of people who gave pushback on it because, well, it's about pro wrestlers and what kind of an audience, because that's what they always want to know. What kind of audience are you looking for? Who's going to read your book and all this other stuff? And there are not a lot of books that feature pro wrestlers as the main characters. Certainly not fiction, at least. I think Mick Foley, Mankind, he wrote one fiction novel with that is kind of about a pro wrestler. But even then, that's the only one I could ever find. So a bit hard to get somebody to pay attention to it, but once they did, hey, now it's doing great, and I couldn't be happier.
Actually, and I want to ask about that. How long have you been a pro wrestling fan? Are you a pro wrestler yourself? Because I saw the photos that they sent me, and I don't know, you look like you could be a pro wrestler yourself.
Well, I was on the wrestling team in high school, but that was as far as it went. If I had known what how to even look into doing any sort of amateur type pro wrestling, because that was back in the '90s, where not a lot of information. You had to really know where to look and stuff, and I did not. But I would have enjoyed it. But I was on the wrestling team in high school, although I was terrible. You're right. I'm a big guy. I was as a freshman. They were putting me up against juniors and seniors because of my weight class, and I think my first match I lasted about 30 seconds because I didn't know the guy put me in a 3/4 Nelson. I had no idea how to get out of it, so I just rolled over. But uh, but it was fun. I enjoyed it, and I've been a pro wrestling fan since I was a little kid. I remember. the first stuff I remember watching was going over to my friend's house to watch WrestleMania 6, I think it was, with Hogan and Warrior. And we were going crazy over that and cheering over it. And some of those were like seminal memories of mine. That and the Undertaker zipping people up in body bags and Jake the Snake using a cobra on Randy Savage. These are sorts of things that I remembered vividly as a kid. And even though I didn't have uh, cable TV, my parents never got cable TV, I would go to other friends' houses and watch it and stuff like that and followed along with it. And I always really liked it. I always thought it was fascinating.
And when we talk about the book, I'm going to ask specifically why you said it in the time period that you did, but we'll get to that. But I want to hear, I got to ask some of your favorite matches. Well, I mean, you used to mention Hogan and Warrior, but I'm curious, any other matches that are like, are your go-to, like,
Okay,
matches?
well, there's a couple. I love Undertaker versus Mankind Hell in a Cell. That's a classic. I love that one. It's crazy, especially when you know what those guys were going through at the time and what they did to make that match what it was. It's amazing because it wasn't just that Mick Foley got his brains knocked out of him during the match, but Undertaker had a horrible staph infection and it was all woozy and struggling at the same time too. Yeah, they still went out and put on a hell of a match. That was great. Another favorite of mine, Brock Lesnar versus Kurt Angle, the Iron Man match, where it
Mm.
started out where Lesnar hits Angle with the steel chair and then pins him twice in a row after that to get a 2-1 advantage. It was just, I always loved Brock Lesnar, and I thought that was just in general, it's a fantastic match. Most Iron Man matches, they're hard to make engaging for the whole hour, but they did it with that one. That was a favorite of mine. Um, John Cena versus Rob Van Dam at the ECW One Night Stand. That I love that one. Loved it. Cena changed everything up. Same with Hogan Rock. That's another one that I loved. Hogan Rock. Yeah, just off
Hmm.
the top of my head, those are some of my favorites. Yeah.
I'm curious to know, just as a wrestling fan, to you, what is pro wrestling? Is it kind of the moves? Is it the story? Is it the characters? Is it something else? Like, what to you as a pro wrestling fan and somebody who wrote about pro wrestling? What is it to you?
I think that's that's the sort of thing that kind of changes from person to person because pro wrestling, and this is what I think a lot of people who are outside of it don't realize. There's such a broad umbrella that pro wrestling falls under. You've got everything from your lucha libre stuff to your barbed wire exploding ring death matches and everything in between. You can have a match that's like the Daniel Bryan versus I can't remember his name. They just had it. The guy from NJPW. The
Oh, Zack Sabre Jr.
Yes, and you can have like a technical masterpiece, or you can have like an Osprey versus Ricochet that's like a gymnastics competition in the ring, and or you can have something like Undertaker, Mankind in the Hell in a Cell, or you can have something like Rock Austin at WrestleMania 17, and all of these guys they have different things they bring to the table, different ways of doing it, and everybody has their own favorites. You know, like you can listen to Jim Cornette talk all kinds of trash about ECW and hardcore wrestling and stuff. But you know, there's an audience for that. There's people that enjoy that. Great. And you know, you have to have some of all of that to make a full, well-rounded show. You gotta have something that everybody's going to enjoy a little bit, so that there's something to keep a wide audience coming back.
And actually, so before we get into the book, we do have a question from a longtime listener, watcher of our show, Spooky Chris at Smile Bomb. They want to know, I don't know squat about pro wrestling, so I'd be curious to hear everyone on the show's reaction to this. If I want to try to get into pro wrestling, what match should I start out watching?
Oh, hmm.
I know it's kind of a loaded question. I have my answer. I have my answer, but I'm curious to hear you first, sir.
I think if you're going to start them out, I think Rock Austin from WrestleMania 17, but you've got to watch the intro You gotta watch the intro video that they did for it. WWE is always so great at doing those intro video packages. You watch that one to see the lead up to the story, and then you see Rock and Austin, and that was the best of their 3 matches at WrestleMania. And it's got a fantastic story. It's got good wrestling. They're both at the pinnacle of their career, the 2 biggest stars in wrestling coming together. And I think that really will do a good job of showing somebody who's never watched wrestling but is open to it what it can mean when it is done right. And I mean, you can argue about how they did things afterwards with Austin's heel turn and stuff, but the ending of it, with him shaking hands with McMahon and everything else, that was such a shock. That's the sort of thing that wrestling fans live for. It's like that surprise, the oh my god, I can't believe what I just saw sort of thing. So I think that's a really good example to show somebody if you just want to get them interested to begin with.
For Smile Bomb, my answer would be Tomohiro Ishii versus Katsuri Shibata from G1 Climax. I think it was 2012 or 2013, which I don't know if you're familiar with that match, David. It's like sub 15 minutes, and just it's maybe the best sub 15 5-star match I've like ever, and I think I get The Rock Austin. I think that's a great answer. My only problem is that what comes after that, right? If somebody if you watch wrestling after that, I think that sets a standard that's so high, you might be disappointed by everything that comes after. That's the one thing. Unless you watch just WrestleManias or maybe big Raw main events, I think that's kind of it really does set like a very high standard, almost too high. And I do think, I think sometimes first, like you said, I think the intros for that match build it up greatly, but then there's a thing, a little bit, the heel turn. I think that was one of the heel turn, right? With the double turn, right? Yeah. I think that, for a first time wrestling fan, I would only be worried that they'd be confused about a double heel turn. And the whole thing behind that. I'm just going by based off like if somebody had never seen pro wrestling, I would just show them, Shibata, Ishii, because it's just a simple, hard hitting, under 15-minute match, and I think it's something that everybody, from recent reactions I've gotten from non wrestling fans, they love it. And then it's New Japan. I think it's on Daily Motion or YouTube, I believe. But listen, also, like I said, Rock Austin. I don't even go as far. If I have to quantify into only WWE, I'll just also say that, or WWF. Rock versus Bret. I'm not Rock. Bret Hart versus Austin, WrestleMania.
Yeah, that's the other one I was thinking of. The double turn at the end. That was a fantastic one too.
I think if you want to talk about double turn as well, I think that one you can a non-fan can maybe understand a bit more. Where it's like, okay, visually you can tell who the babyface, the good guy is. Bret Hart's coming out in the pain. He's he's playing by the rules at first, and then he turns. And I think a lot of people could understand that on a first viewing if they've never seen pro wrestling before. And also just it has a realistic feel to it. That's the other thing, is that I feel I would want to show a more realistic book match, if that makes sense, rather than kind of more character stuff. Because sometimes, I don't know, sometimes the character stuff hits people and other people it doesn't. I find.
Right. It'll pull them out of it. Yeah. I see. The more focus on the more athletic aspect of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's great.
And speaking of turn, let's turn to your book, Blood in the Holler. And I was able to read a good amount of it. Unfortunately, was not able to finish it, but I will read a review that Kirkus Reviews wrote about it, and they call it a mesmerizing thriller within the peculiar cosmos of professional wrestling. And yes, professional wrestling is a peculiar cosmos. Yes. And so, writing this book, where was that balance between? You obviously want people who are into pro wrestling will know everything, the language that they're speaking in the book, and everything happening during the matches, and the time setting during '97 Attitude Era. and all that. But how do you write in a way that you can draw in people who are not so familiar about it, almost sounding like almost like a lecture, almost.
Well, that was one of the hurdles to jump over. My thesis advisor called it being getting too inside baseball. I did have more when I was originally working on it, more references, more stuff that I brought in that made sense to me. But I realized when my professor pointed it out to me, wouldn't necessarily appeal to a broader audience. And so I had to go back to looking at some other books that I've read that had a similar idea. Like there's a novel Stephen King wrote called The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. And it basically is heavily built around this girl who loves a baseball player named Tom Gordon. Now, I don't like baseball. I've never really watched much baseball. I had no idea who Tom Gordon was. But Stephen King was able to like pull me into it, even though I actually actively dislike watching baseball. But he was able to get me invested in it. And so I tried to kind of model how I brought people into that world off of how Stephen King did. You do a little bit at a time, you sprinkle it in, and but you don't go so heavily on it. And you don't want to go so heavily that you have to lecture people about what's going on. And so I tried to, especially the conversation between the wrestlers of the diner, I tried to set it up so that people could follow what was being said. I bring up names people recognize, like Hulk Hogan or Ric Flair. But I try not to go so deep into it that people will feel lost. And I'm hoping that I succeeded. So far in the reviews, I seem to have. So that makes me very happy because I wanted people to appreciate the history and the hard work that goes into this profession without making them feel alienated while I was doing it. So
So yeah, I just also that's the other thing is that it just happens to be, it's not a pro wrestling book or story, so to speak. It just happens to be a story with pro wrestlers. Would you characterize this that
yeah,
way?
that's how I would characterize it because you'll have something like that Stars series Heels that
Yes.
is about wrestlers doing wrestling and the plot revolves around wrestling. This is more these people happen to be wrestlers. But because they happen to be wrestlers, that sets up a different kind of story than if it was just like random, like a construction worker or something. It sets it up in a different way. And these are people who have different ideas and motivations about how to solve this problem.
Mhm.
So that was what appealed to me because wrestlers have such a their their mindset and their view on the world can be very different than what most of us are used to, and it's interesting to get in their minds and see what their perspective on a situation like that might be.
Hmm. Setting 1997. So this is the height of, I would say, the second, the second peak of pro wrestling popularity during the Attitude Era, and the characters
Right.
even reference it. That one of the characters, I apologize, forget who it was, mentions about Jim Ross getting a
Yes.
call, and then that mentions of WCW, WWF, and the whole war between that. Is there a reason why set it during the Attitude Era when it seems like, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but are you more or were you more of a familiar growing it up with in the early '90s, the Hogan Hulkamania era, or
Well, I grew up with what they called the rock and wrestling era. You know, the Hogan, Warrior, Jake the Snake, all that stuff. Undertaker just starting out, and then I kind of fell out of it for a few years. And I came back to it when SmackDown first aired, and suddenly there was a wrestling show on regular broadcast TV that I could watch and I could keep up with it. And I got back into it again almost immediately. It pulled me right back in. So I'm pretty familiar with both eras. The middle period with like your Bret Hart, Diesel, and Shawn Michaels, I had to go back and kind of watch some of those matches and catch up on that after the fact. But I picked that time and that month because I felt like it was a real turning point. It was just a month before the Montreal Screwjob, just after the Bash at the Beach with NWO. Austin was starting to rise, and all this other stuff, and things were about to really change and explode with pro wrestling. But at that point, it still quite hadn't yet. And you still had some territories still moving around. You had Smoky Mountain Wrestling, you had other things like that. And it was important to me that these be wrestlers that were not big time wrestlers. These were these are your indie guys, and it had to occur at a time when it would make sense. If I had said it right now, you don't have situations like that as much really right now. The indie scene, thanks to the internet and stuff like that, you get a lot. It has a lot more legs. Something like Ring of Honor or something like that, or even OVW, they get more exposure now than they did then. And so even on the indies, you're in a bit of a better position now than you were then. Back then, it really was just, match to match, paycheck to paycheck, struggling to get to the next town and stuff like that. And that's the kind of the setting I wanted to work in with these people. These are not, top of the line stars. These are guys that are just struggling to make a living, and some of them are even really questioning, like, did they make the right choices, and those sorts of things. And that's kind of what I wanted to delve into in that point.
And also the setting as well. Well, first the book starts off in Louisville, Kentucky. You brought up Jim Cornette before. That's where
Yeah.
Jim Cornette's from. Was that did you deliberately choose Louisville, Kentucky to start off the book in, and then and then it goes into apologize, West Virginia or Virginia?
West Virginia, yeah. West
Virginia.
Virginia. I have a particular fondness for West Virginia. I think that it's a state with a very unique history. It's beautiful, but it gets overlooked. Nobody sets stories there. There's no movies that are set there. You don't see a lot of exposure there. But in researching the book, I went there. I spent a week there. I talked to the people. I visited the places that I talk about in the book, and it's a wonderful place. And I thought it deserved to be highlighted in a story like that. As for the Louisville to Richmond route, I was setting it up. Like, I actually set it up by just looking at a map and saying, well, if we started them, if I want them to be here, I need to have a reason for them to be here. So where would they be going? That it would make sense that they'd be going from here to here. So with Midwest American wrestling, you've got Louisville, you've got Richmond. It seems like a reasonable route that they might take. And so that worked out really well. But I wanted it to be in West Virginia because the location, the types of people, and the culture there, I thought really blended well with the story I was trying to tell.
Mhm. I think that's also interesting in the book. I mean, Lester, I would definitely call him the antagonist. He's when you said it in the Attitude Era, this is when also the whole babyface and heel dynamic was also changing, where nobody was like you said, rock and wrestling, Hogan, clearly a good guy, Undertaker, bad guy. But it's funny how you said it in the Attitude Era, and also while Lester is an antagonist, and I would definitely say the villain of the book, he's not some mustache twirling, you know, uh, really evil type of guy. It's almost kind of like he's wrong place, wrong time in his situation.
Yeah.
And with the wrestlers as well, they're not entirely baby who get kidnapped taken by Lester and his peeps, or they're not entirely straight by the book 100% baby faces. So I just find that interesting as well, that the Attitude Era, where at the time this is happening in wrestling with the changing of the babyface heel dynamic, these characters also are not entirely baby faces or heels as well.
Right.
I don't know if that was something you deliberately did, but that was something that was just like struck out to me, just parallels between pro wrestling at the time and these characters.
Well, I definitely, I certainly didn't want to make them one dimensional. And when you're writing something, you can have an idea for a character, but then as you're writing it, they'll kind of take on a life of their own, and you'll find yourself writing it and discovering that you might want them to say or do one thing, but you can't because it doesn't make sense with how like internally you feel they would respond. And that's kind of how I felt with Les a lot of the time. I When working with him, I knew the type of person I wanted him to be. But then as I set up his background, I set up where he came from, I set up what his motivations were, I found that I wasn't uh, I couldn't just make him, like you said, a mustache twirling villain because he he doesn't see himself as a villain. He sees himself as somebody who's in a bad situation himself and is just desperate to get out of it. And while there are certain characters in the book who are less morally complex, um, as far as the wrestlers go, I did try some of them. I used what I'd learned about how some of the wrestlers were, like the one guy, TJ, as the guy who's a bit of a jackass, bit of a bully. Um, I don't necessarily want to say exactly who I based it on, but there are a couple of guys, former champions, who I know from reading about it were exactly like that. The types of guys that would, feel like they need to deck somebody in the face and make him bleed in front of everybody because they feel slighted, that sort of thing. And so that's kind of where that came from. Um, these characters, they they kind of came from multiple places because a lot of these, I was never a pro wrestler myself, like I said, but in high school, um, I had created a sort of a satirical pro wrestling league, and a lot of these characters, these wrestlers, were ones that I had created for that league. Now, and I'd put it up on a web page, and people at my school were reading it and keeping up with what happened in it and stuff like that. Um, and while these characters were altered for the book, I mean, I gave them a lot more depth and detail in the book than I did when they were just like basically caricatures for a satire. They The people who'd read about them felt like they had legs. Like I had
Mm.
other ideas for novels to write for my thesis, for my program, or whatever. But it was my wife who came to me and said, "You need to write about these characters. You need to put something down about these characters now before it gets too late because I think you've really got something with it." And I went along with it because I trusted her judgment, but I didn't necessarily feel the same way. I thought, well, who's going to want to read about a guy named Jiggolo? But she was right. It worked. It worked out, and I couldn't be happier about that.
And one of the last things I want to ask about is the inclusion of I apologize, I forgot her name now, but the woman wrestler, Julia, I think it was.
Julie, yeah,
And and also during this time as well, add to their pro wrestling, women's pro wrestling in America is a lot different than it is now.
yes,
Specifically, the type of matches that they have. And what talk about including, because I'm pretty sure you could have just made this, bunch of just a bunch of boys on the road, but you also it chose to have a woman's wrestler involved, not like just like any type of woman, of female character, but a woman's wrestler. Um, was that something you wanted to also tell a story about as well, just like women's wrestling this time, and just the struggle of being a woman's wrestler in this era of pro wrestling.
I did want to touch on that because especially when you look at women's wrestling now compared to what it was, there were good women wrestlers back then, but they were not given the attention they deserved. And somebody who was outside of the fandom, would probably wonder why the hell would any woman want to put themselves through that? Why would they put themselves in that position? And Julie, Goth Girl, she is another one of the characters that I had conceived of for that satire back then. I had thought of her as, a rough and tumble, hardcore type fighter. Uh, and so that's why I wanted to put her in there, because that's the type of wrestler, that's the type of female wrestler you did not really see at that time. And so I thought it would be nice to see somebody struggling with what they knew they could do and what they were allowed to do. Somebody who was just really tired of only being seen as being good for a pudding match before the main event or something like that. Somebody who wants something more, but is still trying to figure out how to get it. You know?
And so for anybody who's in the New York or attending New York Comic Con this week, where can people find you if they want to get a copy of your book, talk to you about pro wrestling, get it signed, all that?
Yeah, I am going to be at booth 4 in the writer's block, which is right next to the Barnes and Noble. And I'm going to be there all 4 days. It's either going to be my wife will be there if I'm, for whatever reason, not there, but I'm going to try to be there like as much as possible, save for when I have to eat or something.
And
So, but I plan to be there the whole time. Yeah.
great, and that will be getting today's the 10th, 11th. That'll be the 12th to the 16th, I believe, right?
Yeah, it's the Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday.
Great, great.
So, yeah.
And if you want to get a copy of the book, I'm sure you'll have copies there for sale,
I will
right?
have copies there, yes. And there's also, it's available on Amazon. There's an audiobook of it as well. So you can get a physical copy, ebook, or Kindle or audiobook from Amazon, from Barnes and Noble, thrift books, like anywhere. I even seen some people already selling it on eBay, which I was like, what? How did they get a hold of it that fast? I don't know. But, so yeah, and the good news is real easy to find me if you just Google my name. Nobody else in the country with that name, so that's helpful. You want to find it, you Google that, you'll find it in all sorts
And
of places.
And again, for anybody who forgot, the book is Blood in the Holler by David Sangiao-Parga. And David, I appreciate you taking your time to talk to us. Like I said, I was able to read a good amount of the book. Haven't finished it yet, but I'm loving what I like so far. And yeah, we don't get a lot of this pro wrestling. Well, more pro wrestling. We get the TV shows, movies. Was it that
Mhm.
Al Snow thing on Netflix?
Yeah,
Heels, the wrestler, but not a lot of books. I mean, not counting comic books. We don't get
right.
like really in-depth novels about pro wrestlers. I know there was that whole autobiography wave
Yeah,
that
there was the
happened
whole
after that.
autobiography thing, but and I think if you're not a wrestler and you're trying to push it, I had an agent in New York tell me to my face that he didn't think that he could represent this book because the people who like pro wrestling aren't the same type of people that like to read. And I thought, I have a graduate degree in writing and I love pro wrestling. So what are you telling me? You know?
Hmm.
So I think there's been a lot of pushback in the industry, people kind of looking down their noses at it and stuff. But I am confident that there are plenty of people who like pro wrestling and like to read. So
And I am one of them, and I definitely know there's many more out there. So yeah, again, if anybody wants to pick up the book at New York Comic Con, they could go to see David at his booth. Which again, booth was that? Booth four?
booth 4 in
Booth
the
four?
writer's block.
In the writer's block, or if you can't make it to New York, you can get it on Amazon, Kindle, audiobook. Did you do the audio yourself, or was that somebody else?
No, no, no. Penguin actually picked it up for the audiobook, and
Okay.
they had an actor named Steve Maloney do during. He did a fantastic job. Actually, I feel like Kanye West talking about listening to his own albums, but I've been listening to my own audiobook because I really like the way he does the reading. It's very entertaining, I thought. So
And yeah, I highly recommend that anybody out there who's a pro wrestling fan. If you're not a pro wrestling fan, if you like MMA, you can still find it a very compelling novel. If you are a pro wrestling fan, you'll probably enjoy it even more. That's a great thing about it. And if you just I don't know why, if you're not a pro wrestling fan or not an MMA fan, why you're watching us, but nonetheless appreciate it. But you'll still like it as a novel, thriller novel nonetheless. David, thank you again so much for your time, sir. I look forward to finishing the book, and I hope that lots of people come to your booth at New York Comic Con and pick it up.
I hope so too. Thank you.